Today we are talking with Jessica Lahey, the author of Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed. Welcome to Readara.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You're focused on a very important issue that touches millions and millions of parents across the country. Please explain a little bit, how did you end up writing this book? Why did you focus on this topic?
Well, I've been a teacher for a long time, as long as I've been a parent, actually. I was started in my first classroom when I was pregnant with my now almost, as of tomorrow, actually, 18-year-old. So, I am very invested in making sure that my students are able to learn and all of that. And as I went along, I sort of noticed that something was going on with my students. They were increasingly nervous. They were increasingly anxious. They were so obsessed with grades and points and perfection and something was going on where that was affecting their ability to learn, and I wasn't sure what that was. And just at the point that I was sort of most frustrated with the students of my parents for overparenting to the point of helplessness. Their children really were becoming helpless. I realized I was doing the exact same thing to my own children. And so I really was motivated at that point to figure out how overparenting kids, rescuing kids, not allowing them to sort of explore and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, how that was affecting them psychologically and from an educational perspective. And so, I spent 2 years researching that, and the book is a result of that. The book is really the book I needed in order to understand my own parenting and my teaching. I wrote it for parents, but any educator who reads it will really understand I wrote it for teachers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have almost 2 decades of experience in teaching and parenting. How the parent-teacher, or rather parent-child relationship, in your opinion, has evolved, especially we live in a very technologically intensive, social media-driven age?
What's interesting about that is I'm less interested with the influence of things like, Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or whatever kids are using. That's not as interesting to me. What really interests me is how parents' use of technology to do surveillance on their kids. And when I say surveillance, I'm not talking about anything more complicated than parents reading their kids' texts and emails, but specifically on things like parenting portals where parents can log on and look at their kids' grades all day long. And when I say all day long, that's not hyperbole. I know of parents who keep their kids sort of their parent portal, where they can look up their kids' grades all day long on their computer and refresh it all day long as they work. That kind of surveillance is an extrinsic motivator for kids, and unfortunately, extrinsic motivators have an incredibly dampening effect on motivation to learn, on creativity, on kids feeling like they have control of their world, and therefore they end up feeling less invested in that world. And the very things that we want them to be more invested in, like doing well in school and learning, we undermine that by being on top of them constantly on those topics, and keeping close tabs on them actually undermines their motivation to do those things, which is, for me as a teacher and as a parent, really upsetting, because I feel like being involved in their world is what makes me a good parent. But it turns out that we need to back off a little bit and give kids more autonomy to be invested for the sake of the thing itself and be more invested on their own terms.
Could you give us a few examples of what overparenting can do a child? Maybe if you can draw from some of the interactions you have had with children and parents in a way that how they back off or from learning and exploring.
The really classic stories that I tend to talk about a lot in my speaking engagements are things like, when a kid is, especially someone, for example, in middle school or even younger, those kids who are disorganized and constantly forgetting things. Well, what tends to happen is they come into school without whatever it is they need, let's say their math homework, and their teacher talks to them about it and says, okay, well, you've forgotten your homework. What are we going to do about that? What is your solution going to be? Here are some consequences that you're going to have from that forgotten, whatever it is, assignment. And the problem is that more often than not, what ends up happening is the parent brings that homework into school, or sends an email with a scan of that homework, or, in some way rescues the kids. And the problem with that is that it really doesn't end run around the learning process. The kid begins to understand that they don't need to have a process. They don't need to have a system for remembering their stuff, or a system for planning ahead so that they won't forget it again next time, because their system is their parents. And that creates this thing called learned helplessness. That creates a situation in which the child gets that they're going to be rescued at every turn. And that, unfortunately, as I said before, undermines the learning process that the teacher gets really invested in with the kid, especially in places like middle school, where the expectation is that kids are going to show up every day having screwed up in some way, and that the teachers are going to help them learn from that. So when parents don't allow that learning process to happen, it's really frustrating for the teachers, and it as I said, it creates helplessness in the kids, and it's frustrating all the way around, because that process of screwing up every day and learning every day is sort of what middle school in particular is all about.
Mm-hmm. What are children interested at that age? What is that they would like to do or be engaged in that will keep them learning and exploring and growing?
Well, what's funny, when I talk to kids, they actually want more of the responsibility. I mean, I think it's really hard for kids to sort of express the fact that, yes, they need more autonomy in their world, which unfortunately for them means they're going to have to suffer more consequences for screwing up in their world. But when it comes down to it, over and over and over again, when I ask kids, what would the ideal school look like for you? What would the ideal teacher look like for you? What would the ideal parent look like for you? I currently teach in a drug and alcohol rehab for kids, and I just last week asked my students to write about what the perfect rehab situation would look like for you or for them. Over and over and over again, they stress that they do want structure. They just want autonomy within that structure to have some control over the things in their lives. And that's nice for me as an author and as a writer, because as a teacher, because it turns out that in order to get kids engaged in learning for the sake of learning, they need three things. They need autonomy, they need to feel competent, which is not the same thing as confident. Competent means, that they've learned from experience how to manage crises, how to manage problems. And then the third thing they need is to feel connected to their parents, to their teachers, to the fact that the stuff they're learning is actually relevant in their world. So that autonomy, connection, and competence, that really only happens when we give them structure and then step back and allow them to have control over the terms in their world of how things get done and why, and then if they don't get done, that they suffer the consequences of those things not getting done. So, and it's a wonderful positive feedback loop if it gets started the right way, which means obviously not pulling the rug out from kids without talking to them about it first. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Letting go for parents is hard to do for all of them. And it's also a fine line, because if you let go a little bit too much, then sometimes kids can veer into a direction that they may not be able to come back. What would you tell parents that how they can learn to let go, and when they think they haven't let go enough, or they have let go a lot more than they should?
Well, just like it's easiest to start with something that's, a little bit lower stakes, start with things like homework. Homework, one of the things that I needed, at least from my book, was to separate out this whole giving kids more autonomy thing into various areas. You can't start with everything all at once. So, the book is divided into things like, homework and household duties and social life and all of the places where we tend to stick our parental hands in there and muck around a little bit too much. But let's say we start with homework. The nice thing about starting with homework is that you can give really clear expectations around what you expect from your kids, what you think your kids should be able to handle. And you say, look, homework is now your realm. I will not be nagging you. I will not be going down every day, down a list and asking about every single thing you have to do. Homework is now your job. And as your job, if certain expectations are not met, in our house, the expectations were not just, that homework will get done. It was that homework will get done to the best of their ability. Homework will get handed in to the teacher and end up in the place where it was supposed to be, that kind of thing. If those expectations are not met, then here are the really clear consequences that are going to come from that. And again, taking away electronics or something like that from kids when they've forgotten their homework makes no sense in their heads. And when I say their heads, I mean the heads of people whose executive function, their frontal lobes, are not quite developed yet. So for them, it needs to be kept really simple. Okay, if homework doesn't get done and that expectation is not met, then they're going to be in charge of setting up a meeting with their teacher where we all sit down and talk about strategy, and they lead that meeting. So here are the expectations, here are the really clear consequences, and then literally step back, be there, let them know I'm here to support you if you need me, and I'm here to listen, but I'm not going to be teaching you algebra again so that you can get this done. I'm not going to be filling in answers for you. I'm not going to be gluing the science project together at the last second because you forgot it. That's your responsibility. And if you have to show up at the science fair with no project, then you're going to sit there at the science fair for 2 hours and explain your no project to a lot of people. And having done that in the past, it wasn't with a science project, it was something else. Having to sit there in front of something that you're not proud of for 2 hours really hammers home the idea that you need to get a little bit better at strategizing how you finish your work. And it's not the end of the world if a student fails a grade. It really isn't, I promise. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher at a very high-stakes school. I understand the pressure that parents feel they're under, but it really can be an incredible learning experience when a student fails an assignment, given the proper support in learning from that F.
You have the title of the book, Gift of Failure, and as you said just now, it could be an incredibly learning experience when a student fails. When a student fails, what happens to him or her?
Well, first of all, they're embarrassed and they're horrified, and there seems to be, especially these days, that students seem to say, okay, well, can I have some extra help to, some extra credit to make that up? And, hopefully the teacher who understands, the learning that can happen here will say, no, there's, this is what it is, and as long as you've learned the material, let's just keep moving forward. There's a whole extra question to be answered about whether or not, the way we're grading or the way we're doing homework is valuable. But that's a whole other book. There have been times when I've sat down with a family, and I tell this story in the book about a family who was very upset with me over a B- because they felt that was incredibly cruel to their child, since in their opinion their child was just not a good speller, and so that therefore it was just unfair that she would get a B- because she's just not capable of spelling well. Well, it turns out that she was absolutely capable of spelling well. It's just that she needed to learn how to study better and how to prepare better. And that B-, I said to them, this B-, I think is going to be one of the most important learning experiences your child has in middle school. And it absolutely was. It really was. And to head off your next question, which tends to be, especially from when I'm talking to parents, well, okay, you're talking about a B-, but what about a real F? What if a kid is actually failing out of school? And there's a story in the book about that. Towards the end of the book, a mother got in touch with me about her son who was actually failing out of his school. And she decided to show him what would happen if he did fail out of school. And she had him go and visit this really substandard school nearby where he was going to have to go if he failed out of the magnet program that he was in. And he had to spend a day at that school. It might have been more than a day, I can't remember. And she said, look, I'm going to go with you and talk to the principal of your school about getting you a probationary semester. But that probationary semester is going to be up to you. We're not going to back you up. We will back you up, we will support you, but we're not going to do the work for you. And that probationary semester changed his life. He is now off at college. He took control of his work. He took control of his schoolwork. He took control of everything that sort of fed into his schoolwork, and he was able to stay at his school. He did not fail out, and he did it under his own steam. And his mother stays in touch with me, and she said, that really was the most important learning experience of his life, of his school life at least.
When kids are motivated to be better or excel or succeed in their own ways, then things get easier from the learning experience. But what happens when kids just don't want to be engaged or not motivated?
Yeah, I think, the key for those kids is to get at, you actually have to get to know your kid and get to know what their goals are. Sometimes we tend to love the kids that we want and not as much the kids that we have. But getting to know the kids that we have is so important, because if you can talk to your kids about their goals as opposed to grades, the kids can say, well, grades don't matter to me. It's not a big deal. I don't care whether I fail or not. But if you talk to your kids about their goals, if you say, look, what's your plan? What do you want to do? What's important to you? And even if your kid talks to you about video games, you could say, look, okay, so you say you want to have a job, making video games. Let's talk about what that involves and let me help you go meet someone, or let's research what someone who makes video games has to know. And just validating your kids' goals and then helping them understand that in order to get better at their goals, in order to be able to do some of the things they want to do, and maybe those things are sports, and you say, look, in order to play soccer, your school has a rule that you have to have a C or better or a B or better in order to play soccer, and so if you don't get that B or better, you can't play your sport. So what are you going to do to strategize to have that goal? The problem is that we tend to hear kids' goals and think they're stupid. But there are absolutely ways to make even the most, from a parent perspective, stupid goal relative to helping get them invested in the things that we would like to get them invested in.
We all know that children like to spend more time with friends than with parents. Obviously, that is the age when they enjoy being with friends more. How does that affect their ability to succeed or explore, and how does that affect their relationship with their parents?
I think parents tend to get really, really worried about kids that scare them. I mean, kids that are either not motivated, or kids that have piercings in weird places, or parents that, are just worried that a particular kid is going to be a bad influence. And I try to reassure parents and say, look, kids make friendships for really specific reasons. When they're really small, it's just about proximity. It's, whatever kid is closest, they'll be, if parents are friends with each other, then their kids tend to be friends with each other. But that's not the way friendships work later on. Later on, friendships are really about exploring different identities. And I know this sounds difficult for some parents to understand, but sometimes your child's friendship with someone that makes you a little bit nervous is a really good thing, because that means your child is trying out an identity that they're not necessarily going to adopt themselves. Having friendships with people who are different is good, because it allows your child to try out something different from a little bit of a distance. It can be so hard for a parent to look on as their child befriends someone who doesn't believe in the same thing that they want their child to believe in. But the nice thing is, when you talk to your kids in a way that's actually respectful of that relationship and say, look, what is it that's appealing about this kid for you? What is this, and talk about your own friendships and say, look, I've had friendships in my life where people have really fed some negative energy in my life, and I've had to distance myself from those people. Or I'm friends with my friend Sally because she really makes me feel good about myself. And you can say things like, I noticed you've been spending a lot of time with that guy, Derek. Does Derek make you feel good about yourself? How does Derek make you feel about yourself? And asking these open-ended questions of your kids and about their friendships and their relationships are really important. It helps kids understand that, number one, you're listening, and number two, that you actually are respectful of that relationship, and number three, that you're open to talking if something were to go awry with that relationship. So, relationships, as I said, are just a way of trying on various identities, and being a little less nervous that your kid is going to end up just like that kid would go a long way toward help making sure that your kid understands that you're there and you're supportive. But the other problem is that, of course, the minute you try to pull your kid away from someone that you don't think is good for them, they're just going to, gravitate toward that kid. So, if you don't want your kid to latch on to someone you really don't approve of, then just stop talking about it, because your kid often will do these reactionary things just to freak you out anyway. So.
Just as you said earlier, that there were three very important points from a child's perspective. The first was the structure, and the parents can provide the structure and let them be autonomous within that. What?
Well, actually, no, the structure is really, really, yeah, as long as the structure is out there and very, very clear, and as long as limits are very clear, because limits actually are quite important to both, from toddlers all the way up to teenagers. Limits are incredibly reassuring for kids. And this is not at all permissive parenting. This is parenting where the expectations are really, really clear, and then you let the kid have some control over the details, and that you are absolutely consistent with the consequences. I think a common misconception is I'm saying, let kids fail, just step back and let things be what they are, and that's not at all what I'm saying. I just want to make that really clear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What parents can do to create that? What parents can learn to create that structure better, and how that structure can evolve as the child evolves?
Yeah, again, it comes down to really, really age-appropriate, and when I say age-appropriate, we've kind of lost sight of what some of those age-appropriate expectations are. We tend to think of our kids as fairly helpless, but if you think back to, I think back to some of the things I was doing when I was the same age as my children that were actually great learning experiences. I realized, oh my gosh, I was off, doing all of these things independently, doing the stuff that made me consider my childhood an absolutely fantastic place to grow up, or things that may not have been so fantastic but taught me a lot. And oh my gosh, my child is not engaged in anything like that. I tend to think of my children as needing me and needing me to help them, and I tend to extend that dependence without even realizing that I'm doing it. So thinking about actually, and there are lists in the book to sort of help guide what kids are capable of at various ages, especially in the household duties chapter. Helping kids, giving kids really, really clear expectations for age-appropriate stuff, and then stepping back and saying, how you do this is up to you. How you get there is up to you, but here are our expectations for you. And having someone else sort of verbalize really age-appropriate expectations, for me anyway, was really helpful, because from my line in the sand for what my kids can do and can't do has gotten a little bit skewed, and sometimes I need to listen to other people and say, oh yeah, my kid is capable of X, Y, Z, all of these things that I've been pushing off as too hard for them, and getting that outside sort of advice was really helpful for me as a parent. And so I consolidated all of that advice I got as a parent and distilled it down into some lists that are in the book of things that everyone from your preschooler can help with around the house to, what your high school sophomore should be doing, just as being part of the family, the household duties that they can be responsible for.
Mm-hmm. When do you think children should be getting involved with the household work? So because when they go to college, they become obviously far more independent, but with independence comes a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, from as early as possible. I have, there are some great studies showing that kids who are more involved in the running of things on a day-to-day basis, helping the family move forward on a day-to-day basis, whether that's putting their cup in the dishwasher when they're really little, to, being able to run out and do grocery shopping when it's necessary for the family if people are getting busy and can't do it themselves. That sort of involvement in the family helps protect them from emotional distress if things get challenging in the family. If someone were to get sick, if parents were to get divorced, if something, God forbid, were to really happen that's tragic within the family, kids who have a hand in helping in the day-to-day management of the family, really from a day-to-day perspective, really not terribly important basis, like I said, putting a cup in the dishwasher, those kids are less likely to suffer from the negative mental and psychological side effects of that terrible thing happening to the family. There are a bunch of studies that show that. So if a kid feels like they really are a part of the family and helping with the family, and I'm not talking about for money, linking household duties to allowance is something I don't recommend. And then there's another wonderful book actually called The Opposite of Spoiled by Ron Lieber, who's the Your Money columnist at the New York Times. He has this whole book where he talks about, the reasons we give kids allowance are to help them with money management, not to pay them for doing things that are a part of helping the family run. So really simply put, kids who have a hand in helping the family run on a day-to-day basis are less likely to suffer, psychological side effects from the negative stuff that inevitably happens to all families. So right there is a really important reason for me to get my family involved in helping the house run.
In your experience, children should be allowed or should be encouraged to have allowance as early as possible or as late as possible, if there is an allowance, how it should be dealt with?
It's even if it's $1 and you're helping a kid. I adore Ron, and a bunch of other people have come up with this strategy of having 3 different containers, one for saving and one for spending and one for giving. And the idea that you're talking to kids from a very early age about the importance of spending and the importance of saving and the importance of giving away to other people from a very, very early age. Even if you give them $1 in the form of a bunch of nickels or 4 quarters, and talk to them about the fact that they have more in owning those 4 quarters than a lot of kids. And so what is their responsibility in terms of saving and how does saving work? So yeah, from a very early age, it's important. I was talking to my older child, who's now 18 as of tomorrow, and this was about 2 years ago. I was talking to him about compound interest, and I was talking to him about retirement plans. And he said, when exactly am I supposed to learn this stuff? Like, when does someone sit down with me and teach me this? And I said, unfortunately, because we don't teach you this in schools, this is it. You learning it from me, you learning it from someone who is having to budget. That's where you learn it. In Ron Lieber's book, I'm not sure if it's in his book or in his column, he talked about a parent who brought home his entire salary in actual cash and then sat down with his kids, put down the mortgage bill, put down the gas bill, the electric bill, all the different bills, all the different places where they were having to save for college or save to get a new roof on the house, and then showed the kids where all this money goes in order to help them understand their own, what budgeting looks like. That's stuff that we have to teach our kids because, unfortunately, no one else is going to do that for them. So, do we want our kids to leave our house and have the very first bill they pay be the insurance, the insurance on a car, or the very first form they fill out to be their tax bill? I certainly don't. Those are complicated forms. So my kids fill out forms from a very early age. They fill out all their own school forms. I don't do those, so that they understand how to, write down their own address, and so they know their pediatrician's phone number or, whatever the thing is they need to put on those forms. So definitely getting kids involved in money from a very early age is a good thing. And it's not a scary topic. It really is something it's something practical they have to know about.
We've been speaking with Jessica Lahey, the author of Gift of Failure. So much about the book and the topic of parenting and children. Tell us a little bit more about you. How did you end up writing a book? And give us a little bit of background.
Well, as I said, I've been a teacher for a very long time. I didn't used to write about teaching. I used to write about other stuff. And when I sort of finished a project that didn't get published, because, most authors I know have some project that their first big book project that it was just a total disaster and was really a learning experience sitting in a drawer. I didn't know what to write about next. And my husband said, look, you love teaching, so maybe you should write about teaching. And I said, oh, my gosh, no one wants to read about teaching. I was happy to be proved wrong, and my work started catching on sort of in the education sphere. And as it became more and more popular, I was able to write for sort of a broader and broader audience. And I wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2013 about what overparenting does to kids, based on a study that came out of Australia. And that article went viral, and I got really interested in writing a book about that topic because it really interested me. Mainly as a parent, I wanted to figure out how overparenting does influence learning. So I spent a couple of years getting that book done, and I was thrilled that a lot of publishers were interested in it. We were able to have an auction for the book among 10 or 11 publishers. And that, that's been basically what I've been working on and what I go around now and speak about. I teach part-time now instead of full-time, but I still do teach. And I go around the country talking about, at schools mainly, that have chosen to read Gift of Failure as a community read for the whole entire school community. And I go around and talk about how to help kids learn better. through, really clear expectations, and then giving them autonomy and helping them feel competent and helping them feel connected to their parents and their teachers. It's a fantastic, I love my life. I get to write about education, I get to speak on education, and I get to continue to be a teacher and a parent. So, from my perspective, it's been a dream gig.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.